Many a discussion has been had over the merits of RWBY's villains and antagonists, the main argument seeming to be that they are, in fact, bad. Aside from whatever their motivations might be, the largest complaints appear to be that people think they lose too much, and that they're incredibly incompetent, underwhelming, and unthreatening. Now, is there truth to these criticisms, or is the issue a little more complicated than just villains bad? Today, we're going to be talking about where I stand with each of the villains, which ones I think excel and which ones are Cinder, and how I feel about their current trajectory. Because if everyone else is getting AdSense from their clickbait hot takes, so am I. So, it's clear that not many people are a fan of Miss Fall. In theory, I'm fine with her repeating her mistakes as she continually loses her humanity more and more till she's just a monster, or in this case, completely grim. Maybe that could even make her a Wendigo Grim, that's just that hungry for power, just saying. But ironically enough, while Cinder's never been terribly interesting, she wasn't truly bad until Volume 5 came along. The first 3 volumes, especially Volume 3, made her somewhat imposing and interesting, albeit a little bit bland. And Volume 4 introduced a weaker, more vulnerable version of Cinder that could have kicked off, if not a redemption arc, some kind of introspection and regret as she kept digging her grave deeper and deeper. At least till she hit the pipes under Haven Academy and wound up frozen for a month. And that could have been the case had Volume 5 Cinder not fully reverted back to her old self, even ignoring her desire for revenge on RWBY. Instead, she chooses to taunt Jean, which, while it works for Jean, doesn't fully work for Cinder unless she acknowledges that she's obligated to not target RWBY, and instead decides to go after Jean to torment RWBY given how much they care about each other. Basically, instead of showing Cinder to be actively resisting her urge to slit RWBY's throat and target Jean, instead, she doesn't acknowledge RWBY at all. In fact, that desire to spite RWBY every step of the way might have even helped inform her decision to target Weiss, but nah, Weiss is just the easiest target, apparently. There is still hope for Cinder, depending on where they go with her character, whether she has enough animosity and self-reflection to make her actually have more depth than a puddle, and on how engaging and fitting her backstory is if they ever choose to share it, should it exist. But for right now, even with how great Volume 6 is, Cinder is just kind of the worst. The Albanes, meanwhile, are not as nearly frustrating as Cinder, but they are bland and forgettable. Their supposed plot to eventually take Adam's place as leader of the White Fang in favor of their weirdly religious, cult-like version of the group's ideology does not matter. Their desire to manipulate rather than be on the front lines, undermined by the end of Chapter 8 of Volume 5. And even Corsic, being the more devout of the two, winds up getting contradicted by Fennec being the one to kill himself for the cause, while his brother takes his cell riding away, trying to contemplate just going along with the plan in Fennec's place. It feels weird putting Watts on this list, though, considering how little we know of him, and that his motivations and backstory probably aren't meant to be relevant until the Atlas arc rolls around, given it being his homeland. Still, he doesn't do much of anything in Volumes 4 through 6. I mean, he made the Black Queen virus back in the Beacon arc, he bullied Leo for like 5 minutes for funsies, he helped Cinder fuck up negotiations in Volume 5, and he also made Tyrion a creepy new stinger, but nothing really beyond that. I have faith that he'll be engaging soon enough, but for right now, sorry, Dr. Professor Watts, your PhD doesn't really seem to have been worth it. Now, I almost always enjoy the villains that fall under Tyrion's archetype, you know, the crazies who are totally off their rocker. So to have a villain like him with a goddamn scorpion tail who is also creepily zealous is a real treat. And he's arguably the most fun of any of the villains. But like Watts, Tyrion's backstory and reasons for his devotion to Salem haven't been shared, so there's not much to go off for him. Also, his outfit is so boring. I like the coat, but where are the colors? His name is a shade of purple, and he's wearing a bunch of boring white and ugly browns. Why? And Hazel? Well, he's either a good or bad villain, depending on your feelings on his backstory and how it was handled. In a way, the contradictions of him joining the woman whose monsters presumably killed his sister fit with his short-sighted rage towards Ozpin, fit the nature of his semblance to dull his nervous system, very well ignoring his own body screaming at him that he's about to die until it's too late. He is a mass of contradictions fueled by emotion rather than logic. The real issue with his character is in how clumsily his backstory was given to us during the Battle of Haven, instead of, as Blizek posits in his video about Volume 5, beforehand from Ozpin to Oscar, to keep us in suspense until Hazel's discovery and subsequent explosion of anger. Like the other villains, it really depends on where his character goes from here. That'll ultimately decide my feelings on his character and role as an antagonist, but I certainly do not absolutely hate him. But even at their worst, the villains all still have the potential to be interesting, dare I say even great. But now let's get into the villains who really shine. Now, the most obvious examples of truly great villains in the series are in Roman Torchwick and his BFFFL Neapolitan, or were in the former's case. Roman was always meant to be a red herring, a very small-scale threat who had very little role in the grand story, and yet even so, that is kind of what made him so compelling. Roman's entire goal is survival, as he did whatever it took to guarantee he would have a place in the new world order that his bosses intended to create, even if it meant complete and utter destruction. Not to mention Roman's humor and dialogue easily catapulted him to one of the most relatable and enjoyable characters in the show, along with his care for Neo. Whatever their relationship, their bond was incredibly endearing, especially thanks to RWBY Chibi, and this even helps to flesh Neo out as her own villain with her grand return in Volume 6, during which we all cried happy tears.
What are you doing?
Neo is far more motivated than most people give her credit for, and goddamn does she rock the bowler hat. I'm very excited to see where Neo goes, presumably in her eventually turning on Cinder just like Raven did, and shish kebabbing the bitch's other eye out, and maybe even teaming up with RWBY in the process. But her fighting style, personality, and design definitely help her stand out from the crowd. Then we get Emerald and Mercury, who are high-key underrated and infinitely more interesting than their boss. Emerald grew up on the streets with nothing and looked up to Cinder for looking after her. So much so Emerald without Cinder feels lost. Mercury, meanwhile, feels right at home with Salem's cabal, given he grew up abused and likely tortured by his assassin father, and even lost his semblance to him. Both Emerald and Mercury were shaped by dark pasts, and the intrigue in their stories come with whatever choices they will make, whether to stay loyal to Salem or to try to make amends for their misdeeds. Even Salem, as conflicted as I've felt about the Lost Fable since its initial release, is far more interesting thanks to her backstory and her struggle in accepting mortality. In a way, her wanting to return Ozma from death, leading to the apocalypse, and now our current struggles, is the struggle that we all face as living, dying creatures, and ties quite well into RWBY's overall theme in accepting the darkness of the world and doing the best we can despite that. And Adam, honestly, is the best villain, given his character's complexity. The reason that it seems like I hate him is not because I hate how he's written, but rather that there are plenty of examples of Adams in our own world, abusing and manipulating others to gain power and control wherever they can. That is to say that many fell for the facade he put up in being a morally grey figure fighting for Faunus' rights, when really he was a victim of abuse who himself became an abuser, and a monster bent on spiting those who he believed wronged him, human and Faunus alike. I'm going to make a video all about Adam's character on his own, so I'm not going to dwell much on him here, but suffice to say, the version of him that's given so many people cognitive dissonance and turned them off of his fate in Volume 6 itself kinda proves the true nature of his character. And now that we've discussed the villains on their own, I didn't touch on Raven because she's not really a villain, she's more of a anti-hero, kind of morally gray character. I really like Raven, actually, so we're good. It's kind of clear that even in the worst cases of these villains, I still enjoy their premise, but dislike certain parts of their story's executions. In respect to them being their own characters, for the most part, they're fine. But this doesn't address one of the bigger criticisms that the villains lose far too much and come across as astoundingly incompetent, which I half agree with. In concept, I am all about Haven being a victory in that Volumes 4 and 5 were a recovery from the fall of Beacon, and the heroes beating the odds and securing some kind of victory, no matter how small, especially given that right out of the gate in Volume 6, we learned that this was essentially futile given...
How do I destroy Salem?
You can't.
I especially stand by this, given that if the story were to be constant losers in darkness, I would lose interest pretty quickly and just be numb to it all. And if anything, the Haven victory and the lack of major character deaths makes me more nervous for whatever awaits during the fall of Atlas, not less. That said, in execution, the villain's plan to destroy Haven was bad because of sloppy execution for primarily Cinder's character for aforementioned reasons. The victory essentially was earned not by the heroes truly proving themselves and outsmarting the villains, but by the villains fumbling like idiots. The only true exception to this was Blake rallying together the Flawless Militia and also having the brains to call the authorities, because Blake's Volume 5 story is actually good and I will not retract that statement. Some have also explained that we need more direct parallels between the heroes and the villains to really get invested in their stories, which I'm not against in theory, but I don't think it's truly necessary. Adam has already done a great job in his role for Blake and Young's character arcs and relationship in forcing them to overcome their problems, and the trauma he inflicted upon them will continue to affect them until the show's end. And though many want Mercury to do something similar for Yang, I rather feel that with how far Yang has come, she would wind up forcing Mercury to confront his own decisions, either digging his grave deeper and sealing his fate, or getting him to switch sides. I am still bitter, though, that Weiss and Emerald have literally no real conflict despite it being present in the intros of Volumes 2 and 3, and their characters kind of paralleling each other quite nicely, with Weiss being born into privilege and Emerald being born into poverty. But again, it would be nice to see, but it is not crucial. Really, it all boils down to how disconnected most of the main heroes have felt from the main plot up until this point, even RWBY, and by proxy how separated they feel from the villains. The reason why the Battle of Haven may feel superficially exciting, at least in terms of premise, is because rarely in this show do the heroes and villains clash. If there were ever a time to build on any parallels or rivalries between the heroes and the villains to make things feel personal, while also fleshing out the characters of the more lackluster villains, now is the time to make up for past failings. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this from me, then be sure not only to check out my other videos RWBY and otherwise, but also to subscribe and ring that bell for notifications because YouTube hates creators. I'm also currently trying to save up to purchase ISBNs and commission the book art and interior format for my book Diseneribus from the Ashes, so any kind of support, whether it be on Patreon or through watching these videos, or checking out the old first chapter and synopsis for it in the description below, would be very much appreciated. I am currently undergoing a 6th draft for the novel, and let me just tell you, the writing is getting a major glow up. I'm the Unicorn of War, and this has been a shit show.
I've been instructed not to kill her, but you can do as you please.
But that wouldn't be fair now, would it?